Hello A-level students, I hope this video finds you well. We are going to move on from looking at the context of The Handmaid's Tale to a series of videos looking in more detail at narrative and perspective in The Handmaid's Tale. This video today will also cover some suggestions on the 1984 comparison task that you guys have been grappling with over the last week or so. If you didn't manage to get that done, or if you were someone who contacted me to say that you were struggling with it, don't worry. There'll be some information in here which will help you approach that task. If you did approach it, if you have done it, then there'll be some information in here which will allow you to reflect on it. We'll cover in this lesson more generally the narrative perspective, and we'll also look at the idea of unreliability, and then the following lessons will look in more detail at how the perspective is constructed in the novel. So let's think overall then about narrative perspective and why that's valuable for us. There's a very useful short glossary published here by AQA that's specific for the imagined worlds question. And really the series of lessons that I'm calling lesson 2 on narrative construction are really focused on these 6 key concepts. We'll also look as well at the structure of the narrative. So we know what a narrator is, and we'll look at the influence of narrative voice. We will be considering the way that the fictional story world is communicated to the reader. We'll talk about characterization, not just of perhaps the central character Offred, but how other characters are perceived or presented through Offred. And then really key to us is this concept of point of view and the idea of a perspective through which the underlying reality of the text is presented. The final point on there is also going to be crucial for us. We'll look at the way that speech and thought are presented in Handmaids and how we can go about evaluating that. Okay, so be prepared to take notes. Obviously pause the video at any point. If there's anything that you really don't understand or that you don't think I've explained well, then please just contact me in feedback. And I'm happy to go back over things and clear up any misunderstanding. Let's ask the first question. What is perspective? Well, these are all, I guess, perspectives on a sunflower, and they all conceivably could be images of exactly the same sunflower, but viewed from different perspectives. We've got a microscopic close-up. We've got a kind of a cross-section that shows not just what's above the ground, but what's below the ground. We've got a kind of an aerial view that sees a bigger picture, a wider picture, but from a somewhat unnatural perspective. We've got close-ups that show you detail, but either cut out other details or leave them kind of blurred in the background and focus on particular things. And we've got one, I guess, the bottom right there, that looks at the sunflowers in a kind of a setting, and you've got that dramatic sky there. I suppose we can consider perspective in written texts as being similar to this. Authors, like photographers, like artists, have a variety of different perspectives or options for perspective open to them when they consider how they're going to represent their subject, be it a sunflower or be it a dystopian society. And their choice of perspective really influences the way that their readers perceive what's being presented, just as all of these pictures give you a very different view of a similar object. So it's useful for us to obviously get a strong idea of the unique perspective used in The Handmaids and how that affects the way that we perceive the subject. So we know that Atwood in Handmaids presents Gilead through the perspective of a narrator who's also a character. And we need to describe that form of narration as homodiegetic. And that's narration that takes place within the action. That's narration where the narrative voice is a part of the action. The opposite term to that is heterodiegetic, where the narration is occurring from outside the action. But we also have intradiegetic narratives where there's a mix of the narrator being inside and sometimes outside the action, and that's something that can be applied to Gatsby, where there's a lot of narrative flexibility within that text. So if we're having a first-person homodiegetic narration, it means that everything we learn about Gilead is mediated, i.e. comes through Offred's experience. Offred's view of the world is immersive and inescapable. We don't have any other means of checking what Offred shows us. We're limited, if you like, to her perspective. So her perspective is, of course, itself limited. She can't see into the future, and she can't know for sure what's in the minds of other characters. Sometimes there are forms of narration that are unlimited in terms of narrators who can do amazing things, who can read minds, or who can see the future or present the future to readers. Offred's isn't. Offred's is realistic in that it's much like our own perspective of the world. It's limited. We can't tell the future. We can't know exactly what people are thinking. Yes, we can present our impressions of that. And I guess the concept of impressions is quite crucial to understanding that we see Gilead through Offred's impressions. There is one exception to that, which is the historical notes at the end, which offer a completely different historical perspective. And that's the only time where we are able to access Gilead from outside of Offred's impressions. Now, 1984 is similar in some ways, but different, in that 1984 is written in the third person, but the perspective is focalized or fixed onto the main character, Winston. So you looked at two passages from 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, which presented similar events, and the independent task that you were asked to do was to compare the way in which these dreamlike sequences are presented. I think these two passages provide a really stark stylistic contrast in that they're very, very different in style. Of course, there are meaningful similarities about them as well. I'm not going to do a whole lesson devoted to feedback on this task, and I'm not going to give you detailed feedback in the way that I have for other assessed pieces, because I don't intend to assess this. I guess this is more of a kind of an independent practice task. But I will feedback generally on the kinds of things that you came up with. Here are some of the ideas that I came up with. In 1984, we've got a third-person narration, which is heterodiegetic, and that's focalized on Winston's perspective, as we said. The 1984 extract was in the past tense, and it used aspect in meaningful ways. The past perfect, the had happened, the had and the past tense version of the verb presented a lot of these thoughts and actions as completed and finalized. But in the end, that final sentence in this extract here, looking up at him through the green water, hundreds of fathoms down and still sinking, that was in the progressive aspect. So although these were events in the past, they were presented as ongoing actions. The sentence grammar in 1984, they're predominantly complex sentences with a lot of subclauses and adverbial clauses. There's also a lot of abstract nouns in the 1984 extract. A lot of abstract nouns related to emotion, and that, I think we could suggest, creates this sort of emotive semantic field as well. There's a strangely formal register, and some of the lexis is quite sort of multisyllabic, quite formal lexis, creating this formal register, one's intellectual life, and that grammatical perspective of using one to discuss Winston's ideas sort of has the effect of, I suppose, depersonalizing them somehow. There's also some figurative language in there, but we can think as well about the discourse structure of this article, of this text. The actions within the dream sort of frame Winston's thoughtful and in some ways detached reflections on his relationship with his mother and his sister, and how the kind of emotional tragedy of what has happened to him is being made impossible by the conditions of the dystopian society that he lives in. And there's a kind of framing, especially in the slightly shorter extract that I presented here in the blue text box here, in the imagery of his mother and his sister are used to sort of frame his reflections, and finally Orwell returns to the image of his mother and sister drifting away at the end as a way of kind of completing that frame and connecting, I suppose, the way that he thinks to his memory. Handmaid, by comparison, the extract that you were given is stylistically quite an interesting one. We know that it's going to be in the first person and be a homodiegetic narration because everything is in Handmaid, but it's presented in the present tense, which is significant because these are past actions. By presenting it in the present tense, I think Atwood gives this dream some kind of immediacy. It may have happened in the past, but it feels to Offred as if it's happening now. The sentence grammar is markedly a contrast to 1984. There are a long listing sentences within which there are multiple fragments, and they create a sense of the sort of frantic action of Offred's escape and her panic, her sense of rising panic, I guess, as she seeks to look after her daughter. There is no speech in 1984, but Handmaid presents direct speech through Offred's narration in this strange way. It's direct speech, but it's presented within the flow of her sentences using italics. So some of the standard features of speech presentation here are not used. Standard speech presentation, authors often start a new line when they introduce speech. They use speech punctuation. This extract doesn't. The speech in italics kind of runs within the sentences, which I guess helps Atwood to maintain the frantic pace of this extract. There's a couple of examples of figurative language there, which help explain, which help, I think, make sense of, which help Offred to communicate her emotions or the emotional impact of reliving these events. There's a lot of descriptive language and sensory detail compared to the more abstract conceptual thought in the 1984 extract. Particularly we could look at where she's face to face with this leaf, which is described as being very close to her eyes, which helps to establish her perspective of, crouched down in a woodland area and having her kind of peripheral vision crowded by whatever it is she's hiding against. The level of detail provided, really, if you think of the sunflower example where we examine perspective, the close-up nature of that perspective helps to establish Offred's position within the setting very effectively, and the range of sensory detail that's in this extract as well helps to create a sense of, or helps to convey to the reader a sense of a sort of a physical awareness of the way Offred is physically feeling in this extract. There's an example of the passive voice. Which my arms are held, says Offred, which the verb held, obviously, who is doing the holding, who is the subject of that verb, is hidden, and instead Offred foregrounds herself as the object being held by saying my arms are held. That use of the passive voice helps to keep the reader's focus on Offred, and the focus is on Offred and her daughter throughout. The people chasing them down and hunting them down are kind of kept in the background of this extract by using the passive voice in that way. In terms of discourse structure, this is a sort of what we might call an action-driven narrative that runs in a chronological order. These events are presented with their kind of emotional impact as well in chronological order, and the dream slowly fades out into a slightly surreal mixture of Christmas card imagery and the image of the trees that appear to be sort of beckoning. So there's a slightly surreal ending to it. Which helps, I guess, to present the nature of this as a kind of a disjointed, fragmented, dreamlike experience. So that's a summary. That's only some of the things that you might have pointed out. You may have found aspects of those two texts to compare that aren't on those lists, and they could be perfectly valid comparisons. But certainly things such as perspective, tense, the use of sentence grammar, or the discourse structure give you a way to pick apart the stylistic differences in those two extracts. That's a good model for what you do in the Paris anthology, because in Paris anthology you compare style. Obviously, we haven't factored in to this comparison aspects of dystopian genre or aspects of context. But if you did that in your comparison, then that's another valid way of approaching the text. The key thing is, are you able to identify aspects of language and relate them to the way that events are being presented, or the way, particularly for this task, that perspective is being presented. Okay, if you are concerned about, well, I didn't really get a handle on the different perspectives, then use these bullet points to go back and refresh yourself. Go back and annotate those two texts and think about how some of those language levels can be applied to them. And also, don't panic, because the following lessons will all be aimed at boosting your ability to explore perspective and to explore the construction of perspective. Before, though, we move on to that, we'll ask this question of unreliability. Now, we know that narrators in fiction can be unreliable in a variety of ways, and this is something that we did discuss when we were in class. And I found this quite useful little infographic here that presents the idea of unreliable narration on a spectrum, and there's some really fantastic texts there, not all of which I've read, but certainly familiar with some of them. It's interesting that on this scale of reliable to deeply unreliable, the text presents The Great Gatsby as being on the reliable side of unreliable narration, in that I suppose we believe most of what Nick Carraway tells us in Gatsby, but there are contradictions and revisions within his narrative that mean that we can't fully trust him. That is a spectrum that runs all the way to Fight Club. You may have seen the film. I haven't read the novel, but I understand that the novel is an exceptional read, so it'd be well worth looking at. And that's an example of an unreliable text where there's a high level of deception, and in a sense, a lot of what you're led to believe turns out to be false or illusory. Well, okay, the question we would ask ourselves now is, where would we place The Handmaid's Tale? Where would we place Offred's narration on this spectrum? Now, I can't do that accurately because I haven't read all of those texts, but it's definitely worth evaluating how unreliable Offred's narration is. And here's a little collection of quotes, which I suppose which remind readers that Offred is a deeply subjective and unreliable narrator. So, for example, here, Offred kind of admits where she, if you look at the top left quote from chapter 22 there, Aunt Lydia didn't repeat any of this part to Janine, but I expect Moira said something like it. There are sections in Offred's narrative where she recounts second-hand stories, like the story of Moira's escape, which is told through Janine and Aunt Lydia. Well, we're right to ask, how could she possibly know? And she admits in the quote there that it's actually a fabrication or part of her imagination. So we don't know where the truth ends and where Offred's imagination begins. But we also know that she isn't misleading us here, in that she comes out and says, Aunt Lydia didn't repeat any of this part to Janine, but I expect Moira said something like it. So she kind of confesses that this is in some way her own creation. And that's a theme that runs right the way through her narration, with quotes such as "this is a reconstruction," where she confesses to her own unreliability. She also presents her imaginations sometimes as fact. This misleading part at the end of chapter 23, where she considers her imagination of killing the commander after they have one of their illegal meetings. That's a later fantasy that she puts in her narration at a point where she admits it didn't really exist. So it's interesting for us to think how unreliable Offred is, and this was mentioned in class, but we can evaluate Offred's unreliability by saying this, that of course she's unreliable. We know she's unreliable, and she admits to her unreliability, but because we're being presented with a realistic individual perspective, we know that our memory and our perception of events is often unreliable. So she's unreliable in a way that we can perhaps relate to. And this is different to being untrustworthy or manipulative. That's one form of unreliable narration, where a narrator deliberately misleads their readers. And we don't get that from Offred. We also don't get that she's mad or delusional, in that she is self-aware. She's certainly sane enough to know that she can't present these events as accurately as perhaps she would otherwise. So she has this self-awareness to her own unreliability. And with that in mind, it's probably useful to describe Offred as a self-consciously unreliable narrator. She's a narrator who acknowledges and affirms her own unreliability. And that does affect the way that we take information that's given from her. We, on the whole, trust Offred, although as we trust her, we understand that her own version of events is kind of inherently flawed or inherently imperfect, but we're prepared, I think, to accept that about her. So, in summary then, we've looked at this concept of perspective, and we've accurately identified the Handmaids as a first-person, homodiegetic, limited perspective. We looked at how this perspective can form a stylistic contrast with 1984, and we've begun to identify some of the linguistic features that perhaps create that stylistic contrast, that contrast in styles. And then finally, we've had an evaluation, or we've begun to evaluate the way in which Offred's narration is unreliable, and evaluated this concept of a self-consciously unreliable narrator. Thanks for your focus. There will shortly be another lesson following this one, which will look in closer detail at aspects of perspective and aspects of narrative. Thanks again for your focus. If you've got any problems or you think I've missed anything off, then by all means send me an email and I'm happy to clarify. And all the best with your studies. See you soon.